Tell us in the comments which city you're listening from. Click the like button and let's begin this story. When 12-year-old Thomas Bennett stepped through the rusted iron gates of the abandoned Whitmore estate on a cold November afternoon in 2018, he had no idea he was crossing into a mystery that would unravel secrets buried for over 70 years. The estate, located 15 miles outside Portland, Maine, had been sealed off since 1947, its grounds forbidden by county order, its windows boarded, its reputation dark enough to keep even the most curious townspeople away. But Thomas wasn't looking for adventure. He was looking for shelter. Thomas had been living on the streets for 3 weeks. His mother had died 6 months earlier from complications of pneumonia, leaving him alone in a system that had no room for another foster child. The group home where he'd been placed was overcrowded, underfunded, and run by a man named Gerald Krause who viewed the children in his care as nothing more than monthly checks from the state. Thomas had endured the neglect, the cold showers, the watery soup served as dinner, but when Krause began talking about special work opportunities for the older boys, opportunities that involved men who visited late at night with cash in hand, Thomas knew he had to leave. The Whitmore estate rose from overgrown gardens like a Gothic monument to forgotten wealth. 3 stories of gray stone, pointed towers at each corner, stained glass windows that hadn't seen light in decades. The entire property was surrounded by a 12-foot iron fence topped with spikes, but time and weather had opened gaps where determined hands could pry the bars apart. Thomas had been watching the estate for days from the tree line, noting that no security patrols ever came, no lights ever flickered in those dark windows. It was the perfect place to hide until he figured out his next move. The November wind cut through his thin jacket as he squeezed through the gap in the fence. Dead leaves crunched under his worn sneakers as he crossed the courtyard toward the main entrance. The front doors were chained and padlocked, but Thomas had learned in his weeks on the street how to find alternate entrances. He circled the building until he found a cellar window with broken glass, just large enough for a 12-year-old body to slip through. The cellar was pitch black and smelled of damp stone and decay. Thomas used his phone's flashlight to navigate through the darkness, past shelves of dusty wine bottles and furniture covered in sheets. He found a staircase leading up to the main floor and climbed carefully, testing each step before putting his full weight down. The interior of the Whitmore estate was like stepping into a time capsule. Everything was exactly as it had been left in 1947. Furniture sat in perfect arrangement under white sheets. Paintings hung on walls thick with dust. In the dining room, the table was still set with fine china, as if the family had simply vanished mid-meal. The kitchen held pots and pans on hooks, drawers full of tarnished silverware, cabinets stocked with canned goods so old their labels had faded to nothing. Thomas explored cautiously, his footsteps echoing through empty hallways. The house was enormous, room after room of preserved luxury that made him think of museums. But it was the silence that unnerved him most. Not the peaceful quiet of an empty building, but something heavier, more watchful, as if the house itself was aware of his presence. He found a bedroom on the second floor that seemed suitable for his needs. The bed was made with linens that smelled musty but were intact. There was a fireplace he could use for warmth if he could find wood. Most importantly, the room had a good view of the front gates, allowing him to see anyone approaching. That first night, Thomas lay in the antique bed wrapped in his thin jacket, listening to the house settle around him. Wind moaned through cracks in the walls. Floorboards creaked in distant rooms. But he felt safer than he had in weeks. Tomorrow he would explore more thoroughly, find food, make a real plan for his future. For now, he was simply grateful to be warm and hidden. It was the 3rd day in the estate when Thomas discovered the locked door. He had been systematically exploring the house, finding a library with thousands of leather-bound books, a music room with a grand piano still in tune, a conservatory where dead plants stood in ceramic pots like skeletal remains. On the 3rd floor, at the end of a long hallway lined with family portraits, he found a door that was different from all the others. It was made of heavy oak, reinforced with iron bands, and secured with 3 separate locks. Unlike every other door in the estate, which opened easily or stood already ajar, this door was sealed tight. Thomas tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. He examined the locks closely. They were old but well maintained, as if someone had ensured this particular door would remain closed no matter how much time passed. What was behind it? Why seal one room so thoroughly while leaving the rest of the house accessible? The question consumed him for the rest of the day. He searched the house for keys, going through desk drawers, jewelry boxes, kitchen cabinets, finding nothing that fit the locks on that 3rd floor door. It was in the estate manager's office, a small room off the main kitchen, that Thomas finally found what he was looking for. The office was furnished with a large desk, filing cabinets, and walls covered in frames holding documents and photographs. Thomas had avoided the room initially because it felt too personal, too much like trespassing on someone's private space. But his curiosity about the locked door drove him back. The desk drawers were full of ledgers recording household expenses from the 1940s. Payments to staff, orders for supplies, maintenance schedules. But in the bottom drawer, hidden beneath a stack of old newspapers, Thomas found a small wooden box. Inside the box was a ring of keys and a sealed envelope addressed simply, "For whoever finds this room." Thomas's hands shook as he opened the envelope. The letter inside was written in elegant handwriting on paper that had yellowed with age. "To the person reading this, if you have found these keys in this letter, it means you have entered the Whitmore estate despite the warnings to stay away. You may be curious. You may be desperate. You may be running from something as I once was. Whatever your reason, I must tell you the truth about this house and what lies behind the locked door on the 3rd floor. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I was the last person to live in this estate before it was sealed in 1947. I am writing this letter because I cannot take these secrets to my grave, and yet I cannot speak them aloud without destroying lives. Behind the locked door is a room that contains evidence of crimes committed by my family over 3 generations. Not crimes of violence, but crimes of silence and complicity. The Whitmore family wealth was built on stolen labor, manipulated laws, and the exploitation of children who had no one to protect them. My grandfather established networks that trafficked orphans from eastern cities to work in factories and farms where no one asked questions about missing children. I discovered the truth when I was 17, in documents my grandfather kept hidden. I spent the next decade trying to dismantle what my family had built, but the networks were too deep, too protected by powerful people. When my efforts became known, I was threatened, isolated, and eventually declared mentally unstable by those who wanted these secrets buried. I sealed the evidence in that room and then arranged for the estate to be closed permanently after my death. The county believes the closure is due to structural instability. The truth is that I wanted to preserve the evidence but protect the innocent descendants who knew nothing of these crimes. If you choose to open that door, you must be prepared for what you will find. Documents naming names. Photographs of children who disappeared. Financial records showing payments to judges and police. And most damning of all, my grandfather's personal journals describing his operations in his own words, with pride rather than shame. You have 3 choices. You may lock the door again and leave this place, carrying no burden but your own. You may open the door and take the evidence to authorities, knowing it will cause pain to many families but may bring some measure of justice. Or you may destroy everything inside and allow the past to remain buried. I cannot tell you which choice is right. I only know that the truth has power and silence has consequences. May you choose wisely. Margaret Whitmore, October 15, 1947 inch. Thomas read the letter 3 times before its full meaning settled in his mind. He sat at the desk as afternoon light faded through dirty windows, thinking about Margaret Whitmore, about the children whose fates were documented behind that locked door, about the choice now placed in his hands. That night he couldn't sleep. He thought about the group home he'd escaped from, about Gerald Krause and the other men who viewed vulnerable children as commodities. He thought about all the systems that had failed him after his mother's death, all the adults who had looked at him and seen only inconvenience or opportunity for profit. Margaret Whitmore had tried to fight these systems and had been defeated by them. But she had left evidence. She had preserved the truth, hidden it carefully, and waited for someone to find it who might have the courage to do what she couldn't. By morning, Thomas had made his decision. He took the keys from the wooden box and climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor. The hallway seemed longer in daylight, the family portraits watching him with painted eyes as he approached the locked door. His hands were steady as he inserted the first key into the first lock. The locks opened smoothly despite decades of disuse. Margaret had maintained them carefully before sealing the room. When Thomas finally pushed the door open, he found himself standing at the threshold of a space that looked more like an archive than a bedroom. The room was large, with high ceilings and tall windows that had been painted black from the inside to prevent any light from escaping. Filing cabinets lined 3 walls. A large table in the center held organized stacks of documents, each stack labeled with dates and categories. Photographs covered an entire wall, hundreds of faces of children, some smiling in formal portraits, others captured in work clothes standing in front of factories or on farms. Thomas walked slowly through the room, reading labels, opening drawers, understanding with each new discovery the scope of what Margaret Whitmore had documented. This wasn't just evidence of one family's crimes. This was documentation of an entire system, a network that had operated across multiple states for decades, involving dozens of orphanages, factories, government officials, and wealthy families who benefited from child labor. In the center of the table lay a leather-bound journal. Thomas opened it to the first page and read the handwriting that matched the letter he'd found. This journal belongs to Charles Edmund Whitmore, 1875 to 1951. I began my enterprise in 1902 when I recognized that orphan children represented an untapped resource that could be acquired cheaply and employed in conditions that free adults would never accept. Thomas felt sick as he read page after page describing procurement methods, transportation logistics, and financial returns from factories that employed children as young as 6. Charles Whitmore wrote with the detached precision of a businessman discussing livestock or raw materials. But Margaret's additions were different. In red ink, she had annotated her grandfather's entries with names of the children, ages, and fates where she had been able to determine them. Some entries ended with, died in factory fire, 1923, age 11. Others simply read, disappeared, no record. A few, heartbreakingly few, noted, located alive, 1944, provided compensation. The documentation was meticulous and devastating. But it was also exactly what Thomas needed. He spent the next week photographing every document, every photograph, every page of journals and ledgers. He used his phone, charging it with a solar charger he found in one of the estate's sheds. He organized the digital files carefully, creating backups and copies just as Margaret had preserved the physical evidence. But Thomas understood something Margaret hadn't fully grasped in 1947. The power of this evidence wasn't just in proving historical crimes. It was in exposing the networks that still existed, because systems like this didn't simply disappear. They evolved and adapted, but the patterns remained. Thomas began cross-referencing names from the 1940s documents with current organizations. He searched online for descendants of the officials and factory owners named in the files. What he found shocked him. Many of the same family names appeared on boards of modern orphanages, child placement agencies, and companies that contracted with foster care systems. The connections were subtle but persistent. A judge named in Charles Whitmore's journals had a grandson who was now a state senator overseeing child welfare budgets. A factory owner who had employed dozens of orphan children in dangerous conditions had great-grandchildren running private group homes. The network had survived by going legitimate, by taking the same exploitative practices and wrapping them in legal frameworks and government contracts. Thomas realized he had stumbled onto something far larger than historical crimes. He had evidence of systemic patterns that could be used to investigate and potentially dismantle modern exploitation networks. But he also knew that making this public would put him in danger. The people benefiting from these systems had resources, connections, and powerful incentives to keep the truth buried. He needed help. But who could he trust? The answer came unexpectedly. While researching online, Thomas discovered an investigative journalist named Sarah Mitchell who specialized in exposing institutional abuse and corruption in child welfare systems. Her articles had led to multiple prosecutions and policy reforms. More importantly, her background showed she had spent years in foster care herself and had dedicated her career to protecting vulnerable children. Thomas sent her an encrypted email with a small sample of the documents he'd found, enough to prove his claims were credible but not enough to give away everything. He explained his situation carefully, admitting he was a minor hiding in an abandoned estate, but emphasizing that he had evidence that could change child protection policies nationwide. Sarah Mitchell responded within hours. Her message was brief but clear. If what you're showing me is real, this is one of the most important discoveries in child welfare history. But you need protection immediately. Tell me where you are and I'll bring help. Thomas struggled with the decision. Trust had been destroyed so many times in his young life. But he thought about Margaret Whitmore, who had tried to fight alone and had been defeated. He thought about all the children in those photographs, whose suffering had been documented but never avenged. And he thought about the systems that had failed him, that continued to fail thousands of children every day. He sent Sarah Mitchell the address of the Whitmore estate. She arrived 2 days later, accompanied by a child welfare attorney named David Park and a photographer who had worked with them on previous investigations. Thomas watched from an upstairs window as they approached the gates, his heart pounding with equal parts fear and hope. Sarah Mitchell was a woman in her 40s with gray-streaked dark hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that took in everything about the estate with the practiced assessment of someone who had investigated dozens of institutional failures. She called out his name as she approached the front entrance. "Thomas? I'm Sarah. I'm here to help. We brought food, medical supplies, and legal protection documents. Can we come in and talk?" For the first time in weeks, Thomas felt something close to relief. He opened the front door and invited them inside. What followed was the most intensive 3 days of Thomas's life. Sarah, David, and the photographer documented everything in the locked room, cross-referencing Thomas's digital files with the physical evidence. David worked on establishing Thomas's legal protections, filing emergency motions that would prevent him from being returned to the group home or any other unsupervised placement. But it was Sarah who truly understood what they had discovered. "This isn't just about the past," she explained as they worked late into the night. "This is about proving patterns of exploitation that persist across generations. The Whitmore documents give us the blueprint of how these networks operate, how they protect themselves, how they legitimize abuse through legal structures. We can use this to investigate modern systems," David added, and Margaret's testimony, combined with Thomas finding this evidence while running from a group home that was potentially trafficking children, creates a narrative arc that will force people to pay attention. This isn't ancient history. This is an ongoing crisis. The photographer captured everything: the estate's exterior, the preserved interior, the locked room, the documents, and portraits of Thomas standing among the evidence he discovered. The images would be crucial for the articles and legal filings they were preparing. On the 4th day, Sarah made the decision to go public. She sent her first article to a major national newspaper along with supporting documentation that had been verified by historians and legal experts. The headline read, "Hidden Chamber in Abandoned Estate Reveals Century-Long Pattern of Child Exploitation That Continues Today." The response was immediate and overwhelming. The article was shared millions of times within hours. News crews descended on Portland requesting interviews. State and federal agencies launched investigations into the modern organizations connected to the historical networks. And crucially, other victims began coming forward, people who had survived various forms of institutional abuse and recognized the patterns Sarah described. Thomas found himself at the center of a national conversation about child protection, systemic exploitation, and the failure of oversight systems. But Sarah and David carefully protected him from media exposure, allowing him to give testimony to investigators without becoming a public spectacle. The legal actions that followed were swift and comprehensive. Gerald Krause was arrested within a week, along with several associates who had been involved in placing children in dangerous work situations. The group home was closed permanently. Multiple other facilities connected to the same network were investigated, with several shut down and administrators charged with various crimes. But the most significant impact was systemic. Margaret Whitmore's documentation provided researchers and policymakers with a historical framework for understanding how exploitation networks operated, adapted, and survived across generations. New oversight protocols were established. Anonymous reporting systems were created. And significantly, funding was redirected towards supporting organizations that actually prioritize child welfare rather than institutional profit. Thomas himself was placed with a foster family carefully vetted by David Park and Sarah Mitchell. The Hendersons were a couple in their 50s who had fostered dozens of children over the years with genuine commitment and care. They lived in a quiet suburb of Portland, in a house that felt like a real home rather than an institution. For the first time since his mother's death, Thomas had adults in his life who asked about his day, helped with homework, and included him in family decisions. Mrs. Henderson was a retired teacher who understood trauma and gave him space to heal. Mr. Henderson worked as a carpenter and taught Thomas woodworking in their garage workshop, providing physical activity that helped process difficult emotions. The compensation fund established from legal settlements against the organizations exposed in the investigation ensured Thomas would have financial security. But more importantly, David Park worked with the Hendersons to establish a permanent legal guardianship, giving Thomas the stability and family connection he needed. 6 months after entering the Whitmore estate, Thomas returned one last time with Sarah Mitchell and a preservation team. The estate was being transformed into a museum and research center dedicated to child welfare history and advocacy. The locked room would remain mostly as Margaret Whitmore had left it, preserved as evidence of both historical crimes and the courage to document them. Thomas stood in the center of that room, surrounded by photographs of children who had suffered and been forgotten, and made a promise. He would dedicate his life to ensuring their suffering meant something, that the evidence Margaret had preserved would continue protecting vulnerable children for generations to come. Sarah Mitchell stood beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You know what's remarkable?" she said quietly. "Margaret sealed this room hoping someone would find it who could do what she couldn't. And 70 years later, a 12-year-old boy running from the exact same kind of exploitation she documented found it and exposed networks she couldn't touch. She would be proud." Thomas thought about Margaret Whitmore, about her courage to document truth even when she knew she couldn't change the systems that created it. He thought about all the children in those photographs, whose names were now being researched and honored. And he thought about the future, about all the children who would be protected because Margaret had refused to let these crimes be forgotten and because he had chosen to carry her evidence into the light. The Whitmore estate stood as it had for decades, a Gothic monument on a Portland hillside. But it was no longer a forbidden place hiding dark secrets. It was a memorial to truth, to courage, and to the power of documentation to outlast those who would prefer silence. And in that transformation was hope that systems could change, that patterns of exploitation could be broken, and that even the most vulnerable among us could find protection and justice if someone was willing to fight for it. Thomas left the estate that day knowing his childhood had ended the moment he climbed through that cellar window. But he also knew that the adult he was becoming had purpose, had voice, and had proof that one person discovering truth at the right moment could change the lives of thousands. Margaret Whitmore had sealed evidence in 1947, hoping it would matter. In 2018, a 12-year-old boy proved that it did,